Let me read to you a passage from the 18th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel, verses 15 to 20. It's the Gospel for Wednesday of the 19th week in Ordinary Time. St. Matthew writes, Jesus said, "If your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault, just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you have won your brother over. But if he will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of two or three witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. I tell you the truth, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again I tell you that if two of you on earth agree about anything you ask for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where two or three come together in my name, there am I with them." That's from Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 to 20. What does it suggest to us? Well, it speaks of the church. What am I referring to? Well, everyone understands, of course, that the Christian religion is about Jesus Christ. The Christian is a follower of Jesus Christ. Some may have limited notions of this, thinking that this simply means following the example of Jesus Christ or accepting his teachings. They may not understand that it means loving him for the living unseen person he is and being transformed by grace into his likeness. What many do not perceive is the place of the church in the Christian religion. There is no doubt, of course, that nothing must be allowed as coming between Christ and the Christian. The Christian loves and follows Christ, but many interpret this to mean that the church is largely irrelevant or an accident or a mere historical instrument for bringing Christ to the nations. But this is not the mind of Christ on the matter. With great deliberation, Christ established his church, and as St. Paul expresses it, the church is his mystical body. Christ abides in the church and looks on the church as his spouse, for he is the bridegroom. So the church must loom large in the mind of the Christian because it looms large in the mind of Christ. Important questions must be asked and answered. Where is Christ's church, and which of the churches is it? What is its status and role in the Christian life, and how should the Christian comport himself in relation to it? The Catholic Church has clear answers to this, and it presents itself to the world as Christ's envoy, his representative, bearing his authority to teach, guide, and sanctify the faithful in his name. Now I say this as an introduction to our Gospel passage I read earlier, because that passage is one of the passages of the Gospel in which Christ refers to the church. The most notable passage in the Gospels in which our Lord speaks of the church occurs 2 chapters before our passage today. In that passage, Matthew chapter 16, verses 18 to 19, our Lord states that he will build his church on the rock of Simon Peter. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. To Simon, the rock of foundation, he will give the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Well then, 2 chapters later, in our passage today, in talking with his disciples, our Lord again refers to the church. Let us consider the church as spoken of in this passage of today. To begin with, our Lord is addressing his disciples, and therefore the incipient church, the church in embryo as it were. He says, if your brother sins against you, that would seem to be a reference not just to a purely personal slight, but something that is affecting adversely the church. It warrants correction with weight, and our Lord directs his disciples to correct the sin that has been committed against you. The church is being harmed by this sin. Our Lord says if you will not listen, take one or two others along so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Christ is making provision for dealing with harm done to the church by, quote, sins against you. We are reminded of the statement of Pope Benedict XVI that, and I quote, the greatest persecution of the church does not come from enemies on the outside, but is born from the sin within the church. If a member of the church knows of sin that is being committed against the church, it could be, say, underhand, destructive and calumniating talk that harms the church, or scandalous behavior, or heretical teaching, then that person should correct the offender. If the correction has no effect, more persons ought to be enlisted to correct the offender. But still, no result may be seen. In that case, our Lord directs that there be official sanctions that will put an end to the harm. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Christ foresaw excommunication, and St. Paul himself in his letters had recourse to this sanction. The point here is the sacredness of the church. There is an imperative requirement that its life of holiness be protected. The church is so important to Christ our Lord that evils within it cannot be allowed to continue unchecked and uncorrected. What the church formally decides will be sanctioned in heaven. I tell you the truth, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. There is a further indication of the importance of the church in our passage today. Christ guarantees the effectiveness of the church's prayer. I tell you that if 2 of you on earth agree about anything you ask for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 come together in my name, there am I with them. All this is to say that in the divine scheme of redemption, the church matters greatly. St. Paul tells us that we must put on the mind of Jesus Christ, and he loved the church and gave it a tremendous role in his mission. Let us then never disregard the church in our notion of what it means to be a Christian.